Hi again. Page 77 of Creed or Chaos, Dorothy Sayers' book, the last chapter, The Other Six Deadly Sins. She has reached the sin of covetousness, and this is the second part of her discussion of covetousness. Just as the sin of gluttony thrives on our little greeds, so the sin of covetousness thrives on our little acts of avarice, on the stupid and irresponsible small shareholder, for example, who is out to get money for nothing. There is a book called Wall Street Under Oath, which makes entertaining but rather shameful reading. It is an account of the exposure of various great business and banking frauds in the United States at the time of the post-war slump. When we have finished wondering at the barefaced venality, graspingness, and lack of scruple of the notorious financiers who stood in the dock to answer the charge of fraud, we may fruitfully wonder at the incredible avarice and criminal folly of their victims. For no share pusher could vend his worthless stock if he could not count on meeting, in his prospective victim, an unscrupulous avarice as vicious as his own, but stupider. Every time a man expects, as he says, his money to work for him, he's expecting other people to work for him. And when he expects it to bring in more money in a year than honest work could produce in that time, he is expecting it to cheat and steal on his behalf. We are all in it together. I often wonder why Germany was so foolishly impatient as to go to war. If domination was all she wanted, she could have had it without shedding a drop of blood, by merely waiting long enough and trusting to the avarice of mankind. You may remember the sordid and cynical French businessman on the boat that brought Elie J. Bois to England after the collapse of France. Someone asked him, "Why did France break down like this?" And he answered, "Because she had too many men like me." France was bought. The politicians were bought. The press was bought. Labor was bought. The church was bought. Big business was bought. Even the army was bought. Not always by open bribes in cash, but by the insidious appeal to security and business interests and economic power. Nobody would destroy anything or let go of anything. There was always the hope of making a deal with the enemy. Everybody, down to the smallest provincial official and the pettiest petty shopkeeper, had a vested interest in non-resistance. Wars are not made by businessmen who are terrified of the threat to their powers. What businessmen make are surrenders. Nobody prays more fervently than the businessman to be freed from the crushing burden of armaments. The first thing that happens in a war is the freezing of international credits, which the businessman does not like. The same businessman who will view with perfect indifference the senseless destruction of fish and fruit, coffee and corn in peacetime, because it does not pay to distribute them, is preternaturally sensitive about the senseless destruction of property by war. Patience, cunning, and the appeal to avarice could bring the whole world into economic subjection by a slow interior corruption. We may perhaps count ourselves fortunate that Hitler's patience was at length exhausted, and that he conjured up the devil of wrath to cast out the devil of covetousness. When Satan casts out Satan, his kingdom does not stand. But we have come to a grievous pass if we have to choose between one devil and another. If the only deliverance from covetousness is the wrath of war, and the only safeguard against war, a peace based on covetousness. The virtue of which covetousness is the perversion is something more positive and warm-hearted than thrift. It is the love of the real values, of which the material world has only two, the fruits of the earth and the labor of the people. As for the spiritual values, avarice has no use for them. They cannot be assessed in money, and the moment that anyone tries to assess them in money, they softly and suddenly vanish away. We may argue eloquently that honesty is the best policy. Unfortunately, the moment honesty is adopted for the sake of policy, it mysteriously ceases to be honesty. We may say that the best art should be recompensed at the highest rate, and no doubt it should. But if the artist lets his work be influenced by considerations of marketing, he will discover that what he is producing is not art. And And we may say with some justice that an irreligious nation cannot prosper. But if a nation tries to cultivate religion for the sake of regaining prosperity, the resulting brand of religion will be addressed to a very queer God indeed. There is said to be a revival just now of what is called interest in religion. Even governments are inclined to allot broadcasting time to religious propaganda and to order national days of prayer. However admirable these activities may be, one has a haunting feeling that God's acquaintance is being cultivated because he might become useful. But God is quite shrewd enough to see through that particular kind of commercial fraud. And here now we're halfway through the 7 deadly sins, or at least the 6 she makes her subject for this chapter. I'll put on a link to a video we did on Ray Fran's commentary on the history of the Watchtower. We titled that video, Theft, Fraud, Hostage Taking, and Murder. Ray Fran's on the sins of the Watchtower.